Welcome everyone to the Ask the Expert session. Today we're going to be speaking about nutrition. Just to do some introductions at the beginning here, my name is Ross. I'm the Senior Services Officer at Bowel Cancer UK, and I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Nelson, who is a Senior Specialist Oncology Dietitian at the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust. Victoria's worked across the NHS and private care while pursuing a clinical academic career within the Royal Marsden Hospital after successfully being awarded an NIHR grant. As a clinical academic, Victoria splits her time between delivering evidence-based nutrition advice and researching nutrition in those living with and beyond colorectal cancer. So Victoria, thank you very much for giving up your time to be here today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Yeah, so we'll dive straight in. We'll break it up into themes, I think. So we'll start with some of the basics and we'll maybe go into bowel cancer risk, and then we can talk about things like surgery, dietary advice after treatment, all that type of thing. So to dive into the basics then, in a general sense, Victoria, what is a healthy, balanced diet?
Yeah, okay. So something we get asked quite a lot. So a healthy balanced diet is one that really kind of provides all the macro and micronutrients, while also including foods that we enjoy eating, which is important. And we often forget that when we talk about sort of like healthy eating. So just to briefly say, a macronutrient is a carbohydrate, a protein, and a fat, while the micronutrients are more the vitamins and minerals. So it's trying to get an overall balance of all of those within a diet.
Sure, thank you. And in terms of breaking down the macronutrients, so you spoke about carbohydrates, protein, and fat. What are kind of healthy sources of carbohydrates, protein, and fat?
So carbohydrates first, includes sort of like breads, pasta, rice, potatoes, grains such as like bulgur wheat, like couscous, something like that. So where possible, aiming to get whole grain varieties to help increase your overall fiber intake. Fibers are really important for health, especially when we're talking about colon health. Proteins, so we can split those into our animal and our non-animal sources. So sort of eggs, meat, poultry, fish, and then our non-animals are like beans, pulses, tofu, corn, those sorts. And then our fats, so try and mainly get those from vegetable sources like vegetable oils, avocados, nuts, seeds, and small amounts from animal products as well. So sort of like dairy, a little bit of meat as well, because these are good sources of calcium and iron, which we also need.
Great, thank you. That's really informative, because I think sometimes when we hear about micronutrients and what's a protein, what's a carbohydrate, what's a fat, it can be confusing. So thank you for clarifying that. My next question is one that probably people don't really like to ask, but what are the things that we should be eating less of? What are the things that are kind of not that good for us?
Okay, so the main one thing is, as like a population, we consume too much sugar, especially from sort of more sugary drinks, so like fizzy drinks and juices as well, which we often kind of think are healthy, but it's just because it's in a liquid base, it's very easy to consume large amounts of sugar in these like drinks. So the recommendation is just to have 150 mils of like fruit juice or something a day, if that's what you're going to have, and sort of aiming overall for like sugar-free fluids, so like water. If you don't like the taste of water, try and flavor it with like a sugar-free cordial, or add like fresh fruit or vegetables to get a bit of flavor in, herbal teas, and any other sort of like sugar-free drinks that you like.
Great. And what about smoothies? Because even from a personal point of view, I've had smoothies in the past and maybe had the perception that they're a bit healthier. Is that a myth, or are they healthy?
So I guess they're a little bit better from a sugar point of view than juice, because they still have the fiber in them. So you're still getting some of the fiber. It'd be okay again to have like a portion, like I was saying, a day, but it's sort of when you start to put them in the really healthy category and have, you know, large amounts. I have seen some people having a liter of a smoothie a day thinking that it's healthy. And it's just going back to that healthy eating, which is like variety. There isn't sort of one superfood. Health is sort of variety in diet.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. So smoothies, not too bad, just not in big quantities.
Yeah, and juice isn't like awful either. It's just sticking to that quantity.
Sure.
But if you actually pour out the amount, it's quite small. It's not your morning pint glass of orange juice.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, again, that's really helpful, and I think clarifies a lot of perceptions or misconceptions that people maybe have about juices and smoothies, all that type of thing. So thank you. So that kind of covers the basics. Moving on to bowel cancer risk. So in terms of, like, we have awareness volunteers that give presentations and they will speak about some of the dietary components that could put people at a greater risk of bowel cancer. And of course, processed meat is something that comes up. So could you explain what it actually is about processed meat that makes it a kind of risky food?
Yeah, sure. So the recommendation comes from a number of observational studies. So observational studies are when we sort of look back at people that have consumed a lot of processed meat or not, and their risk, like how if they ended up getting bowel cancer or not. So looking at observational studies, it's been found that people who eat processed meat, which is sort of defined as like bacon or salami or frankfurters, that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about processed meat. If they had it daily, they had a slightly higher risk of getting bowel cancer compared to those that didn't eat processed meat. We're not really sure. We don't have the science yet to say the exact link. It's a bit unknown. There's a combination of mechanisms, which contributes to this high risk. I could talk about the mechanisms. It's like,
yeah, sure. If you'd like to go into that, I know that, again, maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong or not, but do the nitrates that processed food have to preserve them, or does that play a part in why they might be a riskier food?
Yeah, so that's one of them. So I mean, the most basic one is that it's much higher in saturated fat and heme iron. So heme iron is the source of iron that comes from animal products, and while we want a bit of it, too much of it is thought to be bad for our colon lining. And so the vegetarian source of iron is non-heme iron, but it's not as well absorbed by our body. So it's sort of getting that fine balance between the two. So a little bit of meat is fine. So the processed meat is very high in this heme iron and also saturated fat, which is thought to promote like the formation of tumors through sort of damaging the colon lining. Then also processed meats are cooked at very high temperatures, so it just exposes them to producing sort of like changes in the meat. So if anyone's ever heard of like heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that's sort of what we're talking about, like that change. And then with the nitrates, so you're completely right. So processed meat, they're sources of the N-nitrose compound, which is thought to have carcinogenic potentials, and again, just slightly change that bowel lining.
Sure, thank you for that. Again, super helpful to clarify all that. Thanks, Victoria. You mentioned red meat in there, which obviously processed meat, a lot of processed meat is also red meat. But red meat on its own, something like, I don't know, mince or, a hamburger that maybe doesn't have these nitrates. Red meat is slightly different in the sense that it doesn't have these components like nitrates, but you mentioned heme iron as well. So is it the heme iron in red meat that's potentially damaging to the gut wall? Is that what's going on there?
Yeah. So it's the same. So it's very similar sort of. So red meat isn't as high risk because it hasn't got the nitrate component of the preservative from the processed meat. And that's why the recommendation is you can have like small amounts of red meat. So the recommendation is 500 grams of cooked meat, which is approximately 750 of raw meat, and that's a week. So sort of spaced out however you want it. And again, it's because often we cook red meat at high temperatures. So like grilling, barbecuing, all of that. And again, that heme iron that we were talking about with the processed meat, it's the same one.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up, because we often get questions asked that are awareness talks, the difference between processed meat and just red meat, independent of the things that are used in the process. And so that's really important.
So I guess just to also clarify, because there's also a lot of confusion about what is red meat and what is processed meat. So like hamburgers and sausages often get classed as processed meat, but as long as like the burger is just like minced meat, that's actually red meat. And again, the sausage, as long as it's mainly meat, so looking at the ingredient and the percentage, and it hasn't got like huge amounts of preservatives, it's actually normally classed as a meat as well. It's a more that Frankfurter style sausage, which is the processed meat.
Sure, thank you for clearing that up. So the next question I have is to do with fiber. Again, we hear that if people have a diet that is quite low in fiber, that can potentially be a risk for bowel cancer. So what is it, Victoria, about fiber that's so special? What does it do for us that kind of has this protective effect?
Yeah, so the recommendation for fiber is 30 grams a day. Very few of us, if any of us, actually meet that recommendation. It's quite hard to meet. And through doing my research, I often get people saying, oh, but I eat my 5 fruit and veg a day. And we do sort of their dietary analysis, and they're having sort of like 12, 15 grams a day. It's quite a shock to sort of report it back. They're always quite surprised. So there's always room for improvement when it comes to fiber, I always say. Different types of fiber are fermented by the colon, microflora, which can influence the types of bacteria in the colon. So sort of term some fibers as like prebiotics. So everyone's probably heard of probiotics, but you need the prebiotic from the fiber to actually, for the good bacteria to colonize. And then it was also thought that diets high in fiber reduce the transit time of where feces sits in our stool. So the less time there is for contact from any things that might damage our colon in our stool to actually damage the colon. So a faster transit time with higher fiber. And also fiber helps with insulin resistance. That's also been shown to be protective for colorectal. Other benefits of just having high fiber are that kind of high fiber foods are very high in a lot of nutrients. So like selenium, vitamin E, copper, zinc, we're talking fruits, vegetables, beans, pulses,
Sure.
Sort of like lots of like those micronutrients that we talked about at the beginning have all been shown to reduce the risk of colorectal cancer.
Great. Do you have any easy tips that people can sneak a bit more fiber into their diet without much, without doing a 360 and completely changing?
Yeah. So I think that's often my biggest complaint is that we often the sort of, if you like look at the internet and you Google like recipes, it's like the gold standard of like just eat beans and pulses and stuff, but we need to have like a middle ground. So I often recommend people good ways of starting to reduce your red meat intake but increase your fiber is to make stews or casseroles or anything with beans and meat, so like half and half.
Yeah.
Or if you're having a barbecue sort of like in the summer, try and have like small amounts of like maybe just like a sausage, but have like a bean salad on the side. So you're kind of increasing your protein from the beans and the fiber. So it's trying to have a bit of more mixture of both instead of saying it has to be one or the other.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way of doing it, because sometimes you think if you're told not to do something, you're more likely to rebel and, just do it anyway. Whereas if you're told, and you can still have some of the things that you like, but if you also have these, some of the things that you mentioned that are higher fiber foods, that's going to have a benefit.
Yeah, so definitely, like in the summer, like salads, like a bit of chicken with chickpeas or something, just trying to get in different flavors and sources of proteins and vitamins and minerals.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Thank you. So moving on to now, this is becoming more nuanced. So diet before bowel cancer surgery or bowel surgery. So for someone who's been told that they require bowel surgery, what nutritional advice could you give to them in their run-up to their operation?
Right. So it's always quite tricky to give sort of like overall advice, because often people might need one-to-one, but overall I would say a balanced diet, as we kind of explained at the beginning. So your healthy like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, fruits, vegetables. But the main thing is trying to maintain weight stable and maintain strength, which is really important. So if there is anything that anyone's struggling with symptom-wise, stopping them from eating as much, might be trying to choose like higher energy meals and snacks. So moving away from like the gold standard healthy that we were talking about, maybe like ice cream or some like full fat yogurts, just to try and keep that weight and that strength, like the muscle strength. So like higher protein. If you can manage like higher fiber foods, so like nuts or hummus or something like that, try and get in some healthy, high energy foods in as well. But also it's really important to maintain active as much as possible. So like walking, resistance exercises, just to help maintain that muscle strength. The high protein diet alone won't maintain muscle mass. It has to be alongside activity. So just, yeah, a bit of both.
Okay, great. Thank you. Really, really good information there again. And the next question is to do with diet during treatment, actually. So we know that cancer treatment can affect a person's ability to actually enjoy food. They might feel sick, they could have a lack of appetite. Some foods might smell or taste different to what they used to do before their treatment. Do you have any tips for people who are experiencing these types of issues?
Yeah, so again, I guess general advice again. So there's obviously like several symptoms, like you mentioned, that can come from treatment. So if someone's feeling nauseated or sick, I'd be recommending sticking to like bland or plain foods and eating little and often. So sort of 6 to 7 times a day. And that would also be the same for someone that had a loss of appetite. So that really small, little and often. If someone's experienced taste change, this is always a really difficult one. The thing is, taste does change like regularly, so it would be to try and re-challenge some of the foods if it did taste bad or there was no flavor from it, maybe like once a week or something, if there was foods that had gone off. But if someone's left with a bad taste after eating, they can try like sucking mints or sweets after eating. If someone's like having like a loss of taste, they can try like spices or herbs or like citrus. Everyone always says there's like they like or dislike different ones and their taste changes. So it's really just trying to experiment what is right for them and their taste change. If they are put off some of their favorite foods, just avoid them until they start to feel their taste has come back. Otherwise, they might have a long-term aversion to that food. And then smell of food, if that's off-putting, try and recommend using colder foods that maybe don't smell as much, or get like friends or family to help with food prep, so you don't have to be in the kitchen with the smell of the food. Or just relying on convenience foods to reduce preparation time. So sometimes if you want to batch cook when you're feeling better and freeze it, have that, or some convenience meals frozen are absolutely fine too. again, going back to sort of maintaining weight and strength is really important. So like any food is better than having nothing when we're talking about going through treatment.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Again, really helpful information there. My next batch of questions is to do with diet after surgery. So we spoke about the benefits of fiber earlier in this conversation. However, after bowel cancer surgery, somebody might actually be recommended, a low fiber diet. Fiber might not be the best thing for healing at that moment in time. So I wondered if you could just give a bit more information on why a low fiber diet might be beneficial for somebody who's recovering from bowel surgery.
Yeah. So generally, the bowels don't really like being touched. So when obviously you've had bowel surgery, someone's gone in and moved them all around, and it takes a while for the bowels to recover and settle down. And fiber is a bit harder for us to digest. So it's really just taking that time to let your bowel sort of like get back to its usual habits, like kind of have a bit of recovery time, and then just reintroducing fiber very gradually, because as I said, it is harder for us to digest, but we know also that fiber is beneficial. So I think sadly one thing I see a lot is that people get told not to have fiber after surgery, and then they avoid it long term, and we sort of lack telling people to like that gradual reintroduction, just gradual challenges. So sometimes I would say start with like peeled fruits or vegetables to help reduce overall fiber, or tinned fruits. Just see how your bowels react to it. If it's fine, you can like add a bit more in like over the next few days. If your bowels react badly, maybe just stay at that level or go back a level for a few days and just re-challenge again a few days later. But it really is important to try and get some sort of fiber back in if you're able to.
Yeah. It sounds like it could be very individualistic, and from person to person it might just be a little bit different. Some people can tolerate a bit more fiber as they're recovering, whereas other people might just have to go a bit more slowly but surely.
Yeah, and I think we discuss it a bit later, but there'll be some surgeries that will not let people have really any fiber at all. So it's also important that if you are very symptomatic, or you've had specific bowel surgery that doesn't allow you to have any fiber, that you don't push through and have the fiber. But yeah, if you can increase it, I've definitely worked with people that we've managed to get their fiber intake much higher than sort of where they were, just because they were scared to reintroduce it. So it's just gradual challenges to get a little bit back in if you're able to.
Sure, great. So the next question, again, it's staying on the whole surgery theme, but we know that people's bowel habits can change. We've spoken about, introducing fiber can be a problem for people. If they have symptoms such as, diarrhea, constipation, and wind, what should people be looking to eat to help? So probably first to start, in the case of if people are having loose stools or diarrhea, what dietary interventions can help?
So the most important thing is if someone's having a lot of diarrhea or experiencing a lot, is fluids, actually making sure. That's always my number one concern if someone's had a lot of loose stools, is hydration levels. So making sure they're replacing fluids through drinking a lot. If they're having a lot, then they need to speak to their medical team. It might be, if it's like an acute sort of diarrhea, they might need IV fluids, or a sort of rehydration plan. So might need some sort of like rehydration salts or sachets. So that's really important. But sort of like first line dietary advice for diarrhea is avoiding, if you think you can deal with it at home, is like avoiding gastric irritants, so like spice, alcohol, caffeine. And caffeine, don't forget, it's not just tea and coffee, it's also in like some fizzy drinks. Like if you're eating a lot of chocolate as well, that there's caffeine in chocolate. I mean, you'd have to eat quite an amount, but it can have an effect. And then obviously looking at the fiber intake, if you are having a lot of fiber, it's sort of like maybe stepping back from that high fiber, or maybe switching some of the foods to lower fiber. So as I said earlier, maybe fresh fruit to tinned fruit, or peeling some of the skins off, just to help reduce some of that fiber, and maybe switching from like whole grain varieties to like white varieties, so like breads, pastas, all of that. And then another one is just looking at if you have a lot of like chewing gum or sugar-free mints. They can also have some sweeteners like sorbitol, mannitol, and xylitol, which have a mild laxative effect. So if you're having a lot of that, then just be aware of that as well.
Yeah, really good information. And in the case of constipation, is it kind of is it similar in terms of fluids, or fluids not what you want to be doing in that case? What tips would you have for people who are actually suffering from constipation?
Yeah, so fluid plays a really important part in constipation too. So obviously, sometimes constipation is just caused that we don't drink enough fluid, because obviously the bowel draws a lot of fluid back in to soften our stools. So if we're dehydrated, our stools will kind of come hard and very difficult to pass. So making sure lots of fluid, so aiming for that sort of like 2 liters a day on average. And then sort of aim for a gradual increase of fiber if you're not having much. So sort of opposite. So maybe trying to add some like beans or pulses, snacks, so like nuts or seeds, fruits or vegetables. And then light activity is really helpful. So sort of like walking can help stimulate the bowel movements as well. But this is all quite general advice. So if sometimes constipation can be really, and diarrhea actually can be really debilitating and really affect quality of life. So if it's something that sort of these general advice tips don't help with, it would be seeking like one-to-one advice and working with a dietitian to get personalized advice really.
Sure, completely understand that. Thanks, Victoria. So moving on from surgery, this is now, there's some questions that I have here for people who may have ended up with a stoma, either temporarily or a permanent stoma. So obviously there's 2 types of stoma, the colostomy, which formed at the large bowel, and an ileostomy, which is formed at the small bowel. Starting with a colostomy, what eating advice can you give people to help them manage their stoma?
So Jenny, if we're talking about colostomies, I would hope that after sort of maybe 1 month post colostomy formation, this is again a very general guideline, I would hope that they would be able to get back to a normal diet. So normally I find people with colostomies aren't as affected as those with ileostomies. There's always the exceptions. But it does depend sort of on how much of the colon has been left and the quality of the colon left. So the main function of the colon is absorbing fluids. It might be following a low fiber diet for a few weeks afterwards, but it's like we spoke about earlier, re-challenging that fiber, reintroducing it gradually after that sort of 1 month-ish period as a very general guideline.
And in the terms of ileostomy, you mentioned there that it might be a little bit different in terms of the advice, that just general advice that people would be given. Can you speak a bit more about an ileostomy?
Yeah, so an ileostomy that is really dependent on how much is left. Obviously the smaller amount is left, there's less capacity for absorption of like fluid and nutrients. So it might be that they have to avoid like normal fluids or like fiber. So when I say normal fluids, sorry, I mean like water and all of that. And it might be that they need more like what we call hypertonic fluids, so with a higher salt concentration, so like diarrhea or St. Mark's solution. They might be advised to add more salt to their food, and that just helps change the gradient of absorption from the body to the inside of the bowel to help more fluid be absorbed. Definitely avoiding fiber if they're having problems with like a high output from an ileostomy. again, I would hope that anyone that's struggling with an ileostomy would have access to one-to-one help, really, because and if they don't, I would be really urging them to ask their surgeon or their oncologist to see a dietitian, to really help sort of make sure that they are getting enough like macro and micronutrients, and they're hydrated.
Sure. Thank you. That's really helpful. We're coming towards the end of our session here, but before I let you go, Victoria, I just wanted to give you some questions around cancer myths, actually. You know, working in this area, we often have people emailing asking about certain, diets or things about sugar and cancer, all that type of thing. So I think it would be quite useful for our audience just to, have these questions asked to a professional and see what the actual truth of the matter is rather than perhaps the myth. So the first one that I want to ask you, you've probably been asked this 100 times in your career. Does sugar feed cancer?
Yeah, so probably hear that like daily, but yeah, so I guess the simple answer is no. So just to explain, so cancer cells, they grow very quickly, they multiply at a much faster rate than our healthy cells. So they take up and they use a lot of energy, which means they use up a lot of glucose. So when I say glucose, I'm talking about sugar. Glucose and sugar are the same thing. As all healthy cells use glucose too, there's no way that we can tell the body to just give glucose to healthy cells and not give it to the cancer cells. And then if we look at diets that cut out sugar completely, such as the ketogenic diet, there's been studies that have shown that people following this have had no reduction in like tumor size, so it hasn't affected the cancer at all, and actually they end up more with like micronutrient deficiencies because they're not having the foods that we know are also healthy and protective. So like the fruits and vegetables, don't forget these contain fructose, which is just glucose molecules combined together, which our body actually breaks down to glucose. But there's fruits and vegetables high in fiber, high in vitamins and minerals, so healthy foods as well. In saying all this, as we said earlier as well, we know that as a population we eat too much sugar, so it's sort of being aware of sugar in our diet, like avoiding those high sugar drinks. If you are partial to like some sugary snacks, just being aware how often you have them and the amount that you have them in. But that's mainly because it's linked more to, obviously there's not as much nutritional benefit in sort of like a tub of ice cream or a family size bag of chocolate, and it can lead to sort of like excess like weight gain, which we know is also linked to some risks of cancer.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Really, again, useful information, and yeah, I think slays a few myths as well that people might read online. So thanks for that, Victoria. The other one is to do with dairy. Does dairy promote cancer?
No, so in actual fact, dairy has recently, in recent years, been shown to be protective for breast and bowel cancer. Again, the links aren't completely understood. It's maybe thought about the calcium content in dairy, but no. And often when we hear this one, we're thinking of like hormones. So in some countries, they're allowed to add hormones to the dairy cattle to help them produce more milk. But in Europe and the UK, we're not allowed to do that. So some of the hormone studies come from other countries. So you just have to be careful where you're reading it from because it's completely different. Obviously there'll be really small amounts of hormones in dairy, but it's negligible, and it hasn't been linked to increasing the risk of cancer. It's actually been shown to be protective. Possibly because of calcium content, but not quite sure.
Sure, thank you for that answer. The final question that I have here is to do with burnt food. We've already spoken about things that might be barbecued, so maybe this is more of a nuanced answer. But does eating burnt food cause cancer?
Yeah, so there has been links to some like burnt food and the carcinogenic potential of the food. So it's just, again, it's a bit unsure with the science when you look at it, but it's just, you know, don't live off barbecued food, try not to burn it. Like if you do burn it, maybe just bin it or cut off the burnt bits, because it does just alter that the structure of the meat, like we spoke about earlier.
Sure. And what about things like burnt toast or crisps that are baked in sunflower oil? Are these things damaging at all, or?
So I guess, so burnt toast, I'm not 100% sure about. I mean, I wouldn't personally want to eat burnt toast anyway, so maybe just like bin it if you burn it. But when we're talking about like, you mean like fried foods that have like got to a high temperature that aren't necessarily burnt, again, as long as it's sort of mainly cooked in vegetable oils and stuff, you're fine. Generally, overall, sometimes cooking at higher temperatures produces a fat. It's completely just escaped my mind. It's not saturated fat. Is
it trans fats or?
Yes, that is it. Thank you very much. Yeah, sometimes produces trans fats, which we don't want to eat too much of. So it again just be a packet of crisps once in a while is fine. But the food industry have been under a lot of pressure to reduce overall trans fats in products. So it is kind of slowly reducing in the foods we consume anyway, but it's just being aware that they are higher in sort of like biscuits and stuff like that in the supermarket.
Sure, good to know. Good to know. We've reached the end of the session here. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. I think we've received a wealth of information here, and I'm sure that this session is going to be very valuable to our community. Before we end here, is there anything else, Victoria, that you wanted to add, or any questions that you feel I've missed, or anything that you get asked quite often that you'd like to just make sure people know about?
No, I think the main thing is just don't be scared of food. I think it's sometimes it's a bit sad for me sometimes when I see people that are really scared of food because of what they've read online. And generally there are some links to food like we've just discussed, but you know, unless you're consuming it day in, day out, a packet of crisps, a chocolate bar here and there isn't doing any damage, and definitely is not linked. Or like there are links, but you sort of haven't caused certain things by having certain
Sure. It's kind of the volunteers that deliver awareness material when they're talking about diet. They'll often say we don't want to frighten anybody into thinking that a glass of wine on a Friday night, or you know, the odd bacon sandwich on a Saturday morning or whatever, that in isolation is not going to lead to a person developing bowel cancer. But obviously if these things start to creep in to a greater degree and become a more predominant part of their diet, that could then, you know, have issues for them. But we certainly don't want to frighten anybody into thinking that these things are going to lead to a bowel cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, definitely. It's trying to enjoy food while having a bit of an understanding of what healthy eating is, I think, is the main message.
Sure. Well, thank you, Victoria. Like I say, I've really enjoyed this session. I'm sure it's going to be really valuable. I just want to thank you for giving up your time to come along and make sure that people have this information. And who knows, in future, you might come back for round 2 and we'll answer some more nutrition questions.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be more than happy to.
Perfect. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming along.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.